Let's talk about this question, right? This question relates to our discussion last week on the role of culture and some of the ways that we can define and differentiate different cultures and their approaches. How many folks believe here that the best answer is high context, low context, individualistic, collectivist? All right, so yes, the correct answer here is low context. So while it's possible that it could be individualistic or collectivist, depending on its approach, the way that ambiguity or lack of ambiguity impacts the conversation can be best answered with context. So this goes back to our discussion last week on different contexts of cultures and some of the ways that cultures might engage in conflict management. Again, the role of culture is a pretty big one that essentially permeates across every single one of these major ideas that we've been talking about in the class, right? So there's these different spectrums that are used to define and differentiate cultures. One of them, one of the big ideas here is the role of context, right? So a high context culture tends to be one with a lot of rules and a lot of kind of ambiguity and specific things that don't necessarily translate really well, but are really unique to that culture. So it might be our use of nonverbal expressions, how directly we choose to communicate, how even things such as tone and style of delivery can alter the conversation too. So high context means there's a lot of that ambiguity there. Individualistic versus collectivist deals with an approach where an individualistic culture generally focuses on its own achievement, on achieving your personal goals. Collectivist cultures tend to focus more on the goals of the group, right? So context would be the best way to approach this question because it deals with the ambiguity or lack thereof in the message. So individualistic is oftentimes associated with more low context culture. The low context would be the best answer here. So last class, again, we had the second study circle share. And again, I really appreciated all of the work and thought that went into your participation in your conversation. As a reminder, if you've already participated in your study circle, I'm asking that you complete your 3-page reflection within 2 weeks of the day that you presented, right? So for folks who did it on Wednesday, that would be on November 3rd. For people who did it on Friday, that'd be November 5th. So just make sure to have that turned in through Canvas. I have both the rubric and some guidelines about how you can complete that. And you can think about your own participation in the process and how it might apply to ideas in the class. And also remember, by the end of the quarter, I'm asking you to complete reviews of 2 of the other study circles that you saw from other groups. So as a result, I haven't taken formal attendance for study circle days because you're either in the study circle or you're commenting by the end of the quarter on the study circle. So you're to some degree participating either way. So for this class, I wanted to talk about the early quarter feedback that I received from you by the end of last week. If you did not have the chance to turn in that feedback form, you can still do that on Google Forms, and I'm still interested in hearing from you. But I want to talk about how the feedback that you received is impacting the course in terms of what's going well and what adjustments to make. So there's also the role of different strategies of negotiation that we'll be talking about. And we'll be looking at a case study that's an application of these different ideas in a little bit more detail. So today is a little bit more lecture focused. We'll have some more time on Wednesday to unpack these ideas further, and then Friday we'll have another study circle. So as far as the early feedback form and the things that I noticed from you all, again, thanks for taking the time to finish that. It's really important for me to know what's going well and what I can do to give you a more positive experience. I do appreciate somebody had a comment about how we need more maps in here. We've got plenty of maps as is, but if somebody wants to, I don't know, if we end up finding another map or poster or something we want to bring in, I'll do that. So some of the things that you all noticed that seems like are working well are the use of practice questions at the beginning of class. It's a way to review and help us think about the ideas. Again, I like to use that to preview what to expect on the midterm. The use of examples and prompts, right? I like using examples, applications, and case studies. In particular, we can think about a couple of the case studies that we've done in the class already, both in terms of things such as the Bay of Pigs invasion, and today we'll be getting into the Iran nuclear deal. as examples of case studies that you could consider for your own essay in the class. We like to give examples of the types of things that you could use or you could analyze as we get to that essay in November, right? It sounds like people like having ways to break things up through like individual prompts, group prompts, participation, and so on. Some of the things that I'm kind of adjusting and changing a little bit. First of all, some terms to know. So one thing that I'm going to do between now and the midterm is at the beginning of class, I'll spotlight the key terms and ideas that are new for the class, and then we'll go through those, just so you know like what is new to expect. Reviewing content for the week. Somebody mentioned having kind of a review at the end of the week that goes over the main ideas that we covered for that week might be helpful. So I'm going to incorporate that. And then if you're feeling like the expectations for the course or your comfort in feeling supported or feeling like you can reach out to me are not what you hope them to be, please let me know. I'm happy, again, got office hours Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 10 to noon, or also through Zoom. I'm happy to talk about if you're feeling behind, if you need catching up, or if you need additional support on assignments. Again, I try to use things like rubrics to help be as clear as possible about what to expect. But if there's any questions there or you need additional support, please let me know. And again, while I do have the form, at any point, if there's anything that comes to mind that you'd like support on or would like to talk to me about, I'm always happy to do that. So to give you a timeline of the next couple weeks and what to expect, right? Today, I asked you to read the 5th chapter of Gantt, so we'll be getting into steps of negotiation. On Wednesday, we'll continue that conversation. We don't have any new readings, but we do have a lot to cover, so we'll continue to unpack stuff. On Friday, we'll have Jonah, Clayton, Ellie, Oliver, Chad, and Abby will be our 3rd study circle. Next Monday, so a week from today, we don't have any new readings or anything like that. It's instead our midterm review day. The best way to prepare for that is to come in with any questions or things that you'd like me to talk about. I'll try to do a quick review, and I'll try to make it kind of fun. Since it's the day after Halloween, I figure might as well make it, kind of entertaining, I guess. And then we don't meet a week from Wednesday, so we don't meet on November 3rd or November 5th, so that should say 11-1 and 11-3 to 5. So on November 3rd to 5th, we don't meet face-to-face, but again, there's that midterm that's taken on Canvas. You have 2 hours to complete it, anytime in that 72-hour window, open note, open book. We're not meeting in class so that you can use that time if you would like to finish the exam. So you might notice as you're working through the study guide that there's several negotiation strategies that are talked about. So we'll be going over the different negotiation strategies for today and using case studies to understand those a little bit better. We'll also be talking about the idea of a zero-sum game, and we'll be talking a little bit about some of the negotiation tactics that can be used, although we'll be building up an understanding of negotiation tactics a little bit more on Wednesday. So I think a good starting point is to understand what negotiation is. And an easy way to understand what negotiation is to understand what it isn't, right? So right here is Henry Kissinger, who served as U.S. Secretary of State under the Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford administrations, right? Kissinger's approach was one that really tried to emphasize different negotiation strategies among different countries, right? He is not necessarily, there's a lot of disagreement and debate among a lot of figures in international relations and foreign policy, right? But Kissinger was known for being an advocate for negotiation strategies. And the way that he and many others have viewed negotiation, including issues like international relations, is that we take the different positions and perspectives that people have on a topic, we essentially put them together, and we have this single unified solution. It's not necessarily a conclusion or an approach that everybody likes or that works for everybody, but at the end of the day, there is a unanimous, agreed upon endpoint that you reach. The negotiation is about how you all work together to put that final idea in place. So if you've ever seen the Schoolhouse Rock, I'm Just a Bill, how a bill becomes law, right? Negotiation is how you get there, and hashing out in order to reach a finalized agreement. If you ever participated in an activity like Model United Nations, right, where you play a part of a member of the UN, you work together to pass a resolution, right, that's also a negotiation process. So negotiation is pretty commonly used. And it's a strategy that, again, involves boiling down opposing views and perspectives into an action to take going forward. So, negotiation is a little bit different than other styles of conflict management, and this is for a few reasons. One of the biggest reasons, right, is that negotiation is essentially a unanimous solution. That is, among the people in the group, they all eventually agree to do this, right? So, while something like passing a bill into law isn't agreed upon by everybody, there is a majority vote, negotiation generally focuses on the people who are kind of essential in order to pass that, right? So if something like an infrastructure or spending bill is attempting to pass, and it's generally speaking a partisan bill, right? There's probably going to be a lot more effort in negotiation to convince the most moderate Democrats in Congress, right, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, rather than like the broader U.S. Senate as a whole, right? There's a focus on the individuals in the negotiation that are perceived as being a part of the ability to change the issue. So it doesn't necessarily require everybody in the group, but the people that are relevant to that particular negotiation are able to work together and ultimately reach an agreed upon solution, right? In this case, getting 50. So there's also the idea that negotiation is not exclusively a coercive strategy, right? Coercion would be something like saying, a boss telling you, you have to do this, or you have to adopt this change to your routine and work schedule, right? You might be familiar with the phrase, there is no room for negotiation, right? And if that's the case, it's not negotiation. There's not an ability of people to work together. So if somebody has that significant level of power over others, then negotiation doesn't really happen, right? Negotiation isn't mediated by a third party. So generally speaking, right, negotiation involves different people in the group who are working together, and the group members themselves are reaching a solution. The difference between this and mediation, right, is that in mediation, it is the third party in the external group who's making the ultimate decision. So you can think about it as a jury, right? It's not the prosecution and defense that work together and reach a solution and say, this is what we're going to do, right? Prosecution and defense present their cases, and the jury makes a decision. That's mediation. Negotiation is about, again, groups working together and reaching a common solution on the problem. So, to understand this, I think it's a good idea to look at the different strategies of negotiation that we use. So we can think about these negotiation strategies as essentially how somebody achieves their goals and reaches the things that they want to reach over the course of the negotiation. And I think a really good context and application to better understand this idea is by looking at the case of the Iran nuclear deal, a topic that is incredibly relevant and significant to us now because there have been new discussions surrounding it and what a potential agreement could look like, but also a topic that has definitely been in the news and been pretty heavily talked about and debated over the course of the last several years. So I'm going to show two different videos, one that's talking a little bit more about the elements of the deal, and the second video talks a little bit more about its current context. And as you're watching, you might think about the ways that different parties on this deal have different interests and concerns, and you might think about the ways that different groups, including different nations such as Iran, the United States, members of the European Union, and so on, are advocating or talking about this issue.
Iran has reached.
This is the checkers game where grandson and granddad will bond.
I'm gonna that.
A historic agreement with major world powers over its nuclear program. But what is Iran giving up, and how does it benefit in the long run? The 109-page document boils down to 5 main areas. Number 1, Iran's uranium stockpile. Uranium is the key ingredient necessary in order to operate a nuclear program. The deal requires Iran to give up 97% of its enriched uranium, taking its stockpile from 10,000 kilograms down to just 300 kilograms. That's much less than what's needed to fuel one nuclear weapon, although Iran maintains the capacity to increase the stockpile quickly. Number 2, uranium enrichment. Uranium comes in different levels of enrichment. A purity of 90% is what's needed to make a weapon. Per the deal, Iran can still produce a modest amount of uranium enriched at low levels, just 3.67%. And if Iran abides by the deal, enrichment is limited in this way for 15 years. Number 3, reduction of centrifuges. Centrifuges are the machines used to enrich uranium. Iran has to give up 2/3 of its centrifuges. Some 19,000 used for enrichment need to be reduced to about 5,000. Iran can also have 1,000 more for research and development. So what this means is, if Iran abides by the deal, for the next decade, it will take Iran at least 12 months to produce enough fuel for a nuclear weapon. And to make sure it doesn't cheat, there will be, number 4, inspections. UN inspectors will be allowed to monitor nuclear and other sites, including military ones, but Iran can challenge requests for access. The inspectors need to provide a basis for concern about undeclared nuclear activity. Any Iranian challenge could delay inspections for up to 24 days. Critics say that could be enough time for Tehran to remove evidence it was carrying out banned activities. So what does Iran get for accepting all of this? Number 5, sanctions relief. The US, the European Union, and the United Nations will relieve many energy, economic, and financial sanctions against Iran that have been crippling the country's economy. Sanctions will likely lift early next year if Iran complies with the principal requirements in the deal. This is great news for Iran's 82 million people, as it's expected to massively boost the economy, increase trade, and bring new investment into the country. So what's everyone else saying? The Obama administration and many European allies see the agreement as a major victory for diplomacy between Iran and the West.
This moment has been a long time coming.
Every pathway to a nuclear weapon is cut off.
But the deal has angered some critics in Republican-led Congress and some parts of the Middle East, including Israel and Saudi Arabia.
What a stunning, historic mistake.
They say the deal lifts all economic pressure on Iran and worry that this windfall will increase Tehran's funding of organizations like Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Assad regime in Syria. They also say the deal only curbs Iran's nuclear program for 10 to 15 years, allowing Iran to move back to the brink of nuclear weapon status without paying any price.
So this is kind of a Wall Street Journal video that goes over some of the major elements of the Iran nuclear deal, right? So I think it does a good job of breaking down the major parts of the agreement, right? And so this was kind of in the 2015 era where this agreement was being worked on and reached, right? Obviously, since 2015, things have changed. There's a more recent video that gets into some of the more recent developments surrounding this, right? But when we think about Iran, a lot of its interests in things like nuclear proliferation are things such as, right, security, expansion of power, concern about other countries, including Israel, and so on, right? So there's a sort of context by which Iran might be pursuing the proliferation of nuclear weapons that is causing, of course, a lot of international concern. And so, right, the effort to make an agreement that's not necessarily agreed upon by everybody, again, there's a lot of critics of that agreement, right, was to try to understand and create a way to prevent the proliferation and possible risk that could come from nuclear weapons and so on. So there's a sort of set of components here, different parts of the agreement, such as sanctions, right, or the economic restrictions put on other countries on trade that typically impact civilians. There's issues related to uranium enrichment, right, and the ability to make a nuclear weapon versus the use of nuclear energy for things such as research and development, generating power, and so on. And so there's a lot of different areas and parts that are kind of up for debate and negotiation. And so we see that that kind of initial agreement was in many ways a result of efforts to establish some level of agreement between different parties.
Iran has reached a
So that's the first one. And then the second video again gets into somewhat more contemporary.
Is the Iran nuclear deal about to be killed off? Well, the deal came after years of tension over Iran's alleged efforts to build a nuclear bomb. It said its program was always peaceful, but the world didn't really believe that. And for 10 years, the UN imposed sanctions. The deal, reached in 2015, brought together the permanent members of the UN Security Council and the EU.
It is a great honor for us to announce that we have reached an agreement on the Iranian nuclear issue.
And it was called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action.
A shared commitment to peace and to join hands in order to make our world safer.
Iran agreed to do away with large parts of its nuclear program and allow international inspectors to monitor what was left. In return, the international community agreed to lift the sanctions, allowing Iran to do business, sell oil, and recover $100 billion of assets frozen in banks abroad. But not everyone was happy. Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister in particular, said Iran could not and cannot be trusted.
The Iran deal, the nuclear deal, is based on lies.
And Donald Trump calls it the worst deal in the world. And he's threatening to walk away unless what he calls the terrible flaws can be fixed. Well, what are those flaws? Some people are bothered by the fact that many of the deal's key provisions expire in 10, 15, or 25 years.
You know, in 7 years, that deal will have expired and Iran is free to go ahead and create nuclear weapons. That's not acceptable.
Then there's the fact that the deal simply doesn't cover Iran's ballistic missile program.
They're setting off missiles, which they say are for television purposes. I don't think so.
And Iran's behavior across the Middle East, its involvement in the wars in Syria and Yemen, that's something that bothers almost everyone. The Europeans say the deal isn't perfect, but it is working, and that it would be crazy to tear it up. Some say it's actually the Americans who are not abiding by the deal.
The US is well advised to finally start honoring its commitments.
Still making it hard for companies to do business with Iran. No one quite knows what Donald Trump has in mind,
I'm not telling you what I'm doing, but a lot of people think they know.
but if he does make good on his threat, then the deal's other backers will have a problem. Do they try and keep it alive by themselves, or do they try and pressure Iran into accepting new conditions? Iran has said if that happens, it too could walk away.
So, this is an example, right, of a lot of different things going on. Since then, my understanding is that there's a kind of new effort to create a revised deal after a lot of it basically fell apart and was undone, right? And there's a lot more to get into surrounding this topic. Again, this is a potential example of a case study to focus on for an essay in this class, because there is a ton to unwrap here that like 6 or 7 minutes of videos is not going to cover in terms of history, context, interests. But I wanted to show this example to not only show the process of negotiation that led to the deal in 2015, but also the ongoing issues that can affect negotiation longer term, right? The larger scale discussions about its effectiveness, risks that the deal might pose, and actions that could be taken in the future to either scrap the deal or to change or repair it, right? I think that understanding this case study of the Iran nuclear deal is a good way to understand the different types of negotiation strategies or things that we might be using over the course of a negotiation. We can divide these into structural, strategic, processual, behavioral, and integrative. So I want to talk about each of these and apply them to this example a little bit more. Again, this is called the original deal that passed in 2015 was referred to as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It sets, the U.S., my understanding, formally withdrew from the deal, but there's current efforts to try to revive or create a new deal out of it. So the first strategy of negotiation, right, is a structural approach. And the structural strategy focuses on sort of the fundamentals of the party. Who are the parties? What are their concerns, and so on. You might think back to Ware's conflict map as an example of understanding structural negotiation. So as a tactic, it's essentially mapping out and figuring out Who are the people? What are they interested in? What are the concerns and the interests? A lot of, for instance, international leaders or people who head into a negotiation on a topic are going to try to target the people that are especially influential, like swing voters, or people that they know are going to have a set of concerns that they need to address. You're speaking to a jury, or you're speaking to a particular audience, right, in a class like public speaking, you know that you need to address the needs and interests that those people have. So there's a lot of different ways you could do that. You could survey them, you could get a sense of their interests, right, through dialogue and so on. But if we were to apply it to this example of Iran and the nuclear deal, right, we can look at each of the different nations and groups at play on this topic and understand the different interests, goals, and concerns that they might have, right? So for instance, Iran might be concerned about things such as the impact of sanctions, which oftentimes affect their civilian population and economy. They might be concerned about their ability to have nuclear weapons or threats that they might face from surrounding countries, might also focus on that for their own military expansion. The United States might be concerned about regional alliances, particularly the impact of instability in places like Afghanistan or alliances with countries such as Israel. The European Union might be concerned about the risk of proliferation that countries like Iran might have toward Israel and so on. So it's kind of mapping out who are the different countries or multinational organizations such as the European Union or the United Nations. What are they worried about? What do they want? And using that, we can understand why some of the components of the bill, such as the sort of limitations on centrifuges, the enrichment restrictions, and so on, might be put in place out of concerns of proliferation. The second strategy we can think about here is strategic negotiation, right? So strategic approaches are generally focused more on the wins and losses that people are experiencing in the conflict. In other words, oftentimes if we're a strategic negotiator, we think to ourselves, to borrow a video game phrase, how do we min-max? How do we maximize the good benefits and minimize the negative consequences? So in this case, right, how much of the nuclear stockpile is being given up? How much is Iran willing to go for? What is okay? How much enrichment can they do? How many centrifuges can they have? What does inspection look like? How often is inspection? How long does this deal run? When does it expire? So those might be areas where the strategic negotiation process develops. Maybe Iran digs their heels in the sand and says, no, we have to have at least 5,000 centrifuges. And that becomes a potential hard line on concessions and negotiations. So strategic negotiation is, again, about figuring out how much somebody is gaining or losing within that process. If you've ever played the board game Risk, right, that's a perfect example. You've got these different pieces on a board of the world. You're oftentimes doing negotiation as you're playing the game and reaching agreements, treaties, and so on with the other people you're playing with. So processual negotiation, right, is referring to the process over time. So as you can probably guess, right, the Iran deal took several years to develop, and since a lot of that has kind of unraveled and there have been new negotiations, that's taken, of course, many, many years. Some negotiations are simple. They can be done in a day or even an hour. But a lot of negotiations take time, especially on more complex topics and topics that tend to involve multiple actors. So this style is recognizing how, over time, people have understood each other in different ways, people have learned, people have engaged, and the way that concessions and so on have been happening have changed. So for instance, you might say that by the fourth round of talks, you're nearing a solution. You figured out an agreement about things such as surveillance and inspectors, but you haven't quite figured out the enrichment percentage. So maybe over time, you're figuring out how have things changed, how has the process of negotiation affected things. So this type of negotiator follows things from the beginning to where things are now and tries to figure out the way that things have changed over time. Behavioral negotiation, right? So, the former prime minister of Israel, who you heard a couple times, Prime Minister Netanyahu, right, was raising a lot of concerns surrounding whether or not Iran was acting good on the process or was still proliferating nuclear weapons outside of the agreement, violating the agreement, right? So in this way, the personalities of many of the different members of this international effort were a really big factor. So for instance, the interests of somebody like Netanyahu, right, who at times takes a pretty hardline approach toward a lot of foreign policy issues. The differences in terms of the U.S. president at the time, right? So Obama's approach was very different from Trump's, which is very different than Biden's approach. The personalities and behaviors of the negotiators are going to be a really big element of the negotiation process. In this case, right, politicians and world leaders are trying to represent their population and their interests. So the way that public opinion changes over time on the issue is going to change how that gets addressed, right? But also the way that we might think about appealing to the personalities and behaviors of different groups. Maybe we know that there's one person that is just going to continue to believe what they believe no matter what and can't change their mind, so we reach out to a different person who we might know is a little bit more flexible. That's how we use behavioral negotiation as a strategy, thinking about the individual behaviors or personalities of the people at play. So one idea here, right, is the idea of a nuclear umbrella. Has anybody heard that term used before in national policy? Yeah, so a couple of you. So the idea of a nuclear umbrella, right, is you might look at the United States and Japan as an example. So Japan does not currently have a nuclear stockpile of its own, but because of its alliance with the United States, Japan knows that if it's ever attacked, including an attack that would require the use of nuclear weapons, that would come from the United States, right? The United States would have Japan's support if Japan was attacked. So while it might not possess nuclear weapons themselves, they know that they can get support from another country if something came up. So that's an integrative approach, right? An idea of a nuclear umbrella or some type of assurance might be a way to resolve not having nuclear weapons for yourself. A lot of countries want them, right? Because having that gives you leverage and security and power in a way that you wouldn't otherwise have. But some countries might be comfortable not having them themselves if they feel confident that an alliance with another country would ensure that they were secure, right? So maybe a win-win is a situation like that. Maybe somebody doesn't want nuclear weapons to proliferate or another country to have them, but they also want to feel that they're secure. And so both parties benefit in terms of preventing proliferation while also promoting security. So that could be using an integrative approach, a win-win that suggests that everybody is able to get what they want out of the deal. Again, that type of approach is a lot more challenging, especially in a lot of complex issues, including international relations. And so that's an area where we might see a lot of disagreement. Another key idea here, right, is the idea of a zero-sum game. And the way that we think about conflicts and deal with conflicts plays a really big role, right? So a zero-sum game deals with the idea that there is essentially a pie, and that for somebody to win, another person has to lose. That is, there is no situation where the pie gets bigger or that we have more pies, but that everybody gets a chunk or a part, and if somebody gets one, that means another person is not getting one, right? So oftentimes a zero-sum game is a way that we'll think about and engage in conflict in a way that avoids collaboration. You might think back to the orange example, the one where two sisters both want an orange, but one person wants to peel or take, the other person wants the juice from the inside of it. So they collaborate together and they realize, hey, we can use that single orange for different things, both get exactly what we want. The zero-sum game says no, there's one orange and there's two people. You have to figure out what to do. So collaboration is oftentimes possible, but a zero-sum game suggests that for one person to win, another person has to lose, and that there's only so many resources and things to go around, right? It's an approach that deals with scarcity. So what I want to do now is divide you into 5 groups that are based on the 5 different strategies that we've talked about for today. And I'm going to have your group take a little bit of time to talk about these strategies in terms of when it's good to use this strategy, an example of this type of strategy, and then some limitations that this strategy might have. So why don't we go ahead and have the 4 folks here on the far side focus on structural. We'll have 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here, focus on strategic. We will have the middle rows here focus on processual. Let's do 1, 2, and 3 on behavioral, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 here on the end, focus on integrated. So 1 person per group can write or type for attendance, and I'd just like you to share when it's a good idea to use this strategy, an example of this strategy, and some limitations of this strategy.